I was in the Pentagon, it was a few years ago, but I was like they call tabletop war game, so about 15 experts sitting around doing scenarios, and I was sitting one seat away from a guy. He was US Treasury financial like delegate to Asia. So kind of ambassador at large for the dollar, and his name was David Dollar. So it's kind of a nice twist, and I said, you know, and this is back when the Iranian sanctions were a big deal. This is before Ukraine. I said, you know, this stuff works to an extent. It's not perfect, but it does work, and we did drive Iran to the bargaining table for the JPO in 2015, so I'm not saying it's completely in effect. I said, but you guys are over, you're weaponizing the dollar. You're taking it too far, and you're going to get a backlash. How many times can you punch the punching bag before the punching bag gets up and walks out of the room? I told him this, like I say, 8 years ago. David D takes his hands, he takes both hands and slams them on the table, palm down, boom. He goes, the US dollar has been the global reserve currency. It is the global reserve currency, and it will always be the global reserve. And I said, David the First, feel like I'm in Whitehall in 1913, listening to John Boo say sterling is the global reserve currency, and it always will be, etc. But hubbus is a good word, you know, plain English, taking it for granted. I mean, if you take your status for granted, then you can do all kinds of crazy stuff and not worry about it, but you can't take your status for granted. You have to earn it every day and through, and we got the trust. We started with the trust earned, like, guess say since 1791, but we blew it, and I've always said, and I told government officials this, I said, I don't really think our adversaries can destroy the dollar, but I think we can do it ourselves. And I would have said, and I have said, you know, in discussing, could China be the global reserve currency? Whatever, and I not to repeat it, but I went down all the elements and mechanics and hedging of a bond market big enough to be the global to absorb global savings, and the Treasury has that. And I said, China's not even close. China's not going to be global reserve currency. I don't know, maybe never. They don't have any of those things. They don't have primary deals. They don't have auctions. They don't have a large bond market. They don't have a rule of law. But then, in thinking about the BRICS currency, I had another one of these like moments, like where you like a light bulb goes on. I said I was doing I was writing or something, doing some research on World War I. Basically, the history of government finance of war is what I was looking at, and I saw this Liberty Bond poster, and it was, you know, Lady Liberty, Statue of Liberty with a torch, and she, instead of the tablet, she had like a Liberty Bond, and she was like, come on America, we got to win the war by Liberty Bonds. And in my book, The New Great Depression, which came out in 2021, was half the book was about the pandemic, half was inflation deflation, but the other half was the pandemic. And one of the issues that came up, because I said, well, it's kind of a new pandemic. One, I read about the old one, and I read like 4 or 5 books on the Spanish flu of 1918, and one of the vignettes was, they didn't know until 1930 what caused the Spanish flu. They didn't know what a virus was really until the electron microscope, but they had a sense that it spread around. And so in Philadelphia in 1917 there was going to be this big parade to buy Liberty Bonds. It was like a freedom win the war pep roll, and all these doctors from the University of Pennsylvania and elsewhere like, don't do this, you know, you're going to get 100,000 people on Broad Street, and you know they're all going to die of the Spanish flu in effect. And they went ahead anyway. They did it because for 2 reasons. 1, that's how important it was, but 2, there was more extreme censorship than there is today. I know that sounds can't be true, but it was. They were arresting people. You couldn't write a newspaper article About the Spanish flu because it was considered bad from morale in terms of the war. In fact, the reason it's called the Spanish flu is that Spain was not in World War I. They were not a belligerent, so their newspaper is like, hey, we got this flu, you know, and they were writing all bad. The rest of the world's like, hey, I read the Spanish newspaper said they got a flu, so they called it the Spanish flu, even though Spain had nothing to do with it, but they were the only country that was allowed to talk about it. But what that did, if you look at the history of these, are some old names. I'm just, you know, been around a while, you know, F. Hutton Dean, Whittam, Merrill Lynch. When were these firms founded? It was around 1910, 1912, 1914, and a little bit later in some cases. But the Liberty Bond was the beginning of the retail investing market. Prior to World War I, as wars were always financed by, like, you know, big shots. You know, Stephen Gerrard financed the war of 1812. Nicholas Bid financed the Revolutionary War. J.J. Cook financed the James Cook rather financed the Civil War. They had these like dealers who did it, but that all changed around World War I. So my point being, there's an example contrary to everything I just said about China building a top-down bond market, and I don't think they can do it. Here's an example of a bottom-up bond market where you basically got retail investors to buy into these bonds. And if you get enough of them, you're going to have a bond market, because somebody will start making a market in it. And let's say you go to a typical Brazilian and you say, hey, you got two choices. You can buy a R-denominated bond, or you can buy a BRICS-denominated bond. That's not going to happen overnight by any means, but I think there is the potential for an indigenous bottom-up retail bond market in the BRICS currency, for the reasons I mentioned. That over time, sooner than later perhaps, could give you something like a reserve currency status. So this thing is so well thought out, and they even things that I would have objected to as recently as a couple months ago said won't happen because I'm like, I've now modified my because I'm like, no, actually it could happen. But they've built their own fiber optic submarine cable. They call it BRICS cable, and because the US is very good at tapping these things, I actually did a job once where I had to figure out all the global telecommunications in the world through cable. Is long story, but there's something called SUMI, which is C is Southeast Asia, WE is Western Europe, and ME is Middle East. So CWME is basically the cable system that connects Asia and London, and then there's a separate one that goes from London to United States. I know where it goes. I can't say, and I know where the Middle East choke points are, and again I won't say those, but the point is, if you cut that cable at one of those choke points where you go off in somewhere in the Mediterranean and cut that cable, you shut down internet communications between Europe and Asia in a heartbeat, and by extension the United States' more sophisticated version is to tap them. Easier said than not. Every now and then the internet will go some problem with the internet. It's like